Playing musical instruments, painting, playing Go. I want to teach myself everything. Young and full of life, I felt that I could do anything. The biggest challenge at the time was whether I could persevere. I didn't know how long I would be detained, what kind of persecution I would suffer, and what would happen after I started the hunger strike. At that time, I could wrap my waist with my hands.
He was carried back on the stretcher. The doctor explained to his family that the best outcome for him was a lifelong disability. He could die at any time.
I could only lie flat. My heart could stop beating if I turned my body. I remembered the teachings of Falun Gong. When you encounter a tribulation, that great compassion will help you overcome it. I can only make up my mind. I will not give up. The past 20 years has been a process of starting over again and again. After I was forced out of the military, I had to adjust to civilian society. Then I was imprisoned twice. Twice, I had to start my life over. When I arrived in the United States, I had to start over again.
We'll then hear from Mr. Zhiming, who was serving as an Air Force officer in Beijing when he began practicing Falun Gong. After the Chinese Communist Party began the persecution of Falun Gong in 1999, Mr. Hu, bypassing China's controls on the internet, he downloaded information on the persecution from the internet. For these activities,
I was a non-combat military officer with the rank of major. After 1992, many military officers started practicing Falun Gong. Like me, whoever refused to give up the practice was expelled from the military.
Hu Zhiming was an Air Force officer in China. His father was an intellectual. In the 1950s, his father was labeled as a rightist for his bold political remarks and was banished to the countryside. Knowing nothing about farming, he had to learn how to use tools and grow crops from scratch.
We were very poor at that time. My parents couldn't afford any extracurricular activities for us, so we had to make our own fun. My father taught us how to paint Chinese paintings. The most we did together was playing Go, a Chinese board game. We picked white pebbles and dark sea snail shells as Go stones and drew the board on a sheet of paper. The funniest thing was that some of the sea snails were alive. They would move around. After my elder brothers went off to college, I was the only child at home and entertained myself by playing the guitar.
When the time came for Zhiming to attend college, he chose to go to a military academy to reduce the financial pressure on his family. In July 1999, the communist regime began its crackdown on Falun Gong. In 2000, Zhiming was forcibly discharged from the army for his spiritual belief. He settled in Beijing. During that time, practitioners from all over the country came to Beijing to appeal for Falun Gong or protest in Tiananmen Square. Since the communist regime banned hotels in Beijing from hosting Falun Gong practitioners, Zhiming's apartment became a temporary dwelling for many of them. During that time, his small apartment was packed with a dozen people every night.
My brother, who lived in California, returned in 1999 and 2000 to appeal for Falun Gong. The last time he was in China was in 1996. Away for 4 years, he felt cordial upon his return. He felt that the Chinese people were very kind and that they could easily understand Falun Gong. They all seemed to have the innate quality to improve themselves through cultivation. Actually, I felt the same way about them. When I was a child, I felt that people were nice and simple. But during college and later in the workplace, I felt that the relationships among people became more and more stressful. I felt that I had a responsibility to help people improve their morality somehow, especially after I started practicing Falun Gong. I believed that Falun Gong would fundamentally change people for the better. So I was so ardent to tell as many people as I could about the practice.
Falun Gong instructs us to always consider others first and take fame and fortune lightly. This concept is easy for intellectuals. Therefore, many intellectuals practice it.
For example, I always decline kickbacks that construction teams offer me. They're surprised at my actions, but I follow Falun Gong's teachings.
We cultivate our moral character. In a moment, you will see that everyone picks up after themselves when we finish the exercises. The ground will be clean, and you can find anything you lost.
The Chinese Communist Party uses propaganda to slander Falun Gong practitioners. The CCP accuses them of committing murder and having mental disorders. Meanwhile, the regime covers up the cruel persecution against them. With his knowledge of technology, Zhiming traveled around the country to teach practitioners how to break through the internet censorship and access Minghui, an overseas Falun Gong website that documents the persecution.
There weren't many tech-savvy practitioners at the time. The regime would purposefully target young practitioners who were competent with technology and arrest them. It was hard for me to find them.
During this period, Zhiming traveled to 12 cities.
Harbin, Changchun, Jilin, Qingdao, Wuhan, Shanghai, and so on.
While teaching practitioners, Zhiming heard accounts of persecution in different regions.
In August 2000, I went to Jilin City. There, 2 practitioners told me what happened to a young female practitioner in their labor camp cell. When she first arrived, she was a cheerful and optimistic girl. But one time, after being tortured, the girl came back a different person. She was very depressed and her eyes were dull. She must have suffered great mental shock. After repeated inquiries, the girl said the police shocked her private parts with electric batons. She was badly burned. She couldn't even walk normally. Every time I heard about the persecution they suffered, it was a shock to my heart. I felt I should do more to help them.
In October 2000, Zhiming arrived in Shanghai. He didn't know that the practitioner he'd contacted was being followed by the secret police. On the night of October 4th, the police broke into his hotel room.
Someone knocked on my door at midnight and said they needed to do a routine check. When I opened the door, 7 or 8 people came in. They asked me to empty my pockets. I felt that something was wrong. I had a hotel receipt in my pocket. It would show that another practitioner was staying next door. I stuffed the receipt in my mouth and tried to chew it up. The paper was hard. I knew that if the police got the receipt, the practitioner in the next room would be caught. I had trouble breathing, so I had to open my mouth for a bit. An officer stuck his hand in my mouth. Amid the turmoil, I was finally able to swallow the receipt. From then on, the officers were very rude to me. They handcuffed me and threw me on the ground. They packed all my belongings and took them away. When a case like this came up, police officers would try to make it a big deal. The bigger it is, the better chance they have of getting a promotion. They wanted to make it a foreign collusion case. They interrogated me every night from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. for about 3 weeks. Feeling that there was little chance in getting what they wanted, they changed their approach. I was sentenced to 4 years in prison for teaching others how to access the Minghui website.
I met Hu Zhiming in Thailand in 2010. We had many things in common, like our hometown, age, and graduation year. He told me about his experience, which was similar to mine. I could see that he was very kind. That impressed me the most when I first met him.
Although they met for the first time in 2010, this was not the first time Huilian had heard of Zhiming. When she was still in mainland China, Huilian learned about Zhiming's persecution from Minghui. At the time, Huilian was also being persecuted for her beliefs in Falun Gong.
At 25, my life seemed to reach an end. Practicing Falun Gong gave me a chance to live a healthy life. I won't give up the practice.
In 1997, 25-year-old Huilian was taking the PhD entrance exam when she was told that she had acute rheumatic fever. A strong believer in science, Huilian hoped that medicine could restore her health. But the doctor told her there was no cure and that she could only rely on steroids to stabilize her condition.
Laying on the hospital bed, I began thinking about the meaning of life. Someone visited me and recommended Falun Gong, saying the practice could improve my health. At the time, it was hard for me to believe, because I didn't believe that a simple Qigong exercise could restore my health.
A year later, the side effects of the steroids were worse than the disease itself. While still taking medication, Huilian started to read Falun Gong books.
Many of my questions were answered by reading Zhuan Falun. My belief in atheism crumbled. I realized that higher beings do exist. When my thoughts changed, a miracle happened. I was cured.
It was 13 years later that Huilian and her future husband met. She was surprised to find that although their paths had never crossed, they were on a similar life journey.
As college students, we were both poor. I could hardly imagine donating money out of my very limited stipends. But when Zhiming was in college, he felt that education was very important. So he tried his best to help poor children living in the mountains. At that time, financial support was about $20 to $30 per month. Whenever he got a stipend, he made donations. He kept it up after he started working. After he began practicing Falun Gong, he noticed that the founder of the practice donated to China's Foundation for Justice and Courage, so he did the same, $150 or $300 each time.
The cells in Tilan Qiao prison were all very small, about 30 square feet. You could touch both sides of the cell by extending your arms out. Each cell usually held 3 people, 1 practitioner, and 2 other prisoners watching them. Usually, the prison gave felons who committed robberies or murders this job. They were promised that if they made the practitioner give up their faith, their prison terms would be reduced by up to a year and a half. Therefore, those who watched me were brutal. In trying to force Falun Gong practitioners to surrender their faith, prisoners have done many horrific things. For example, when cutting the practitioner's hair, they would push the hair clipper directly into their scalp. The blades would leave rows of bloody scratches. Of course, there are also nice prisoners. A young man who watched over me named Chen Jun had been sentenced to 10 years in prison for financial crimes. He was very interested in Falun Gong and liked hearing about it. He helped practitioners a lot, and later, not only did he begin practicing Falun Gong, he also wrote letters to the prison to report how the prisoners were mistreating Falun Gong practitioners. He even protested over the mistreatment. The prison authorities were very angry. He was beaten up so badly that he almost died, causing him to be released. He died shortly afterwards. In 2004, when I had almost completed my 4-year sentence, the prison authorities deprived me of sleep for my final 2 months in prison. This was an attempt to achieve their goal of complete conversion. I went on a hunger strike to protest. Since I was very weak, I went into a coma shortly after. I was then sent to the prison hospital. The prison hospital is another place where Falun Gong practitioners are persecuted. As soon as I arrived, my limbs were stretched out and tied tightly to a bed. I couldn't move at all. I was given an IV and force-fed. I don't know what kind of fluid was put into my body, but during each 2-hour infusion, I had an excruciating headache. My body's reaction became more and more severe, and I started vomiting greenish-yellow vomit everywhere. I felt horrible. A prisoner in the hospital paid a lot of attention to me. When no one was around, he would talk to me briefly. Normally, someone would beg for mercy within 1 day of being tied up. But he noticed that I was calm after being tied for 2 days and even after a week. Because of the painful condition, most people would be very irritable, lashing out, cursing, or screaming. But I was calm. I could even converse with him. He was quite touched by this and wished to know how I was so tranquil. I've been curious about spirituality since I was young. But after receiving a materialistic education, I felt that life was quite meaningless. We are born involuntarily, forced into school, and made to work. We get married, give birth, become old and frail, and eventually we die. It felt like a very sad process. However, an out-of-body experience changed me. It was around May 1995. I was in graduate school when one night, after I laid down, my spirit flew out and floated in the air, looking at my body on the bed. I couldn't move my body. At that moment, I wondered if I was dying. My first reaction was fear, but I thought that I hadn't done anything wrong. I shouldn't die so young. I wanted to get back into my body. With that thought, my consciousness returned to my body, and I could move again. This experience left me perplexed. I needed to know where we go after death and what kind of existence it would be.
In order to find an explanation, Zhiming began reading religious and philosophical books. However, after years of exploration, he still couldn't find the answers he was searching for.
After I started learning Falun Gong, the concept became very clear to me. A human being with worldly thoughts cannot understand the meaning of life. However, during the path of cultivation, he can improve himself constantly. Through this process, he will gradually understand the meaning of life. The path of self-improvement is there for us to take. When we truly improve and reach a higher spiritual realm, we will understand our life's purpose. The young man in the prison hospital who always wanted to talk to me was in his 20s. I told him that the persecution of Falun Gong was wrong. We shouldn't be arrested and coerced to give up our beliefs. We won't give up. We just want to improve ourselves. He was really impressed and agreed with me. He said he would read the Falun Gong books once he was released. During his time in the hospital, he'd often wipe my sweat and clean me. He did all of this voluntarily.
From a boy growing up in a poor family to an Air Force officer who remained kind despite the vagaries of life, Zhiming always hoped his life was on the right track. So when he finally found the path to return to his true self, he threw himself into it. After being on a hunger and water strike for over 1 month, Zhiming was released from prison in 2004. Soon after, he found a job as a programmer. His life finally seemed to be back on track.
My brother is very smart. He learned a lot of things by himself. After 4 years of imprisonment, his health got very bad, and I worried about him. When we finally got in touch, he told me he'd found a high-tech job in Beijing. The company was good and so was the income. He was ready to start over, and I was really happy for him.
In 2005, when I was working in Beijing, I would make DVDs of the 9 commentaries on the Communist Party in my spare time and distribute them in my neighborhood. The people I encountered had various reactions. While some accepted my brochures and discs, many did not. Some were very hostile and reported me. I couldn't predict how people would react to my distributing the materials, so I just did as much as I could.
The 9 Commentaries on the Communist Party is a series published by the Epoch Times. It exposes the nature of the Communist Party and the disasters it has brought to mankind. The series was widely circulated in China after its publication and caught the regime's attention. Those who spread the series were arrested and given heavy prison sentences.
At that time, plainclothes policemen were everywhere in Beijing, but I didn't know that until later. I noticed a few people lingering around while I was handing out DVDs. When I was done and ready to leave, they came over and arrested me.
For distributing the 9 commentaries, Zhiming was sentenced to another 4 years in prison.
I spent the first few months of my second imprisonment adjusting myself, reflecting on why this happened and what I should do in the future. After much consideration, I decided the most effective thing to do was to go on a hunger strike. I wanted to make a clear statement that I'm resisting this persecution. I could also meet with more people like doctors, nurses, prison guards, and other prisoners. I was suffering a lot, but I remained calm and rational. I thought, this will impress the people I meet, since they won't be able to achieve such a calm state in the same circumstance. Therefore, they will be willing to listen to what I wish to tell them. But no matter what, it would be a difficult decision. I didn't know what it would be like down the line or how long I could hold out. At the beginning, not drinking water was hard to tolerate. My thirst drove me crazy. I yearned for water. 3 or 4 days into my hunger strike, I swallowed a mouthful of water one morning while brushing my teeth. It tasted very sweet, but I soon regretted it. I read a book about Xuanzang, a monk in the Tang Dynasty. During his journey to India to obtain Buddhist sutras, he accidentally spilt his water in the desert. He thought, I have no water in this endless desert. I should turn around and go back. While walking back, he felt what he was doing was wrong, so he turned back around and continued his journey. He then vowed not to return until he got the true scriptures. I think that those who truly seek the Dharma or the Tao should have the same determination when encountering tribulations. My desire to eat and drink lasted almost half a year. The whole process was quite unbearable. Every week or so, the skin on my lips would scab and peel. This was part of the pain I had to endure. I also had to resist the temptation to eat and drink. After 6 months, my cravings gradually stopped. I was fine and I didn't think about it anymore.
People don't understand why Falun Gong practitioners go on hunger strikes. If it's so painful, why don't you just eat and be done with it? The way I see it is that Falun Gong practitioners will suffer in detention whether they eat or not. For example, if you don't eat, they will force feed you to make you suffer. Once you start eating, they will use other methods, such as forcing you to watch videos defaming Falun Gong, sleep deprivation, and forced labor. They also put your family in extreme pain. Mothers are forced to give up their children. Couples are coerced into divorcing. Even if you don't go on a hunger strike, you will still be persecuted with the same intensity. So through this method, we have used our own bodies to resist the persecution. Going through this, every moment we were facing the choice between life and death.
I remember a nurse who once force-fed me. She inserted a tube into my stomach through my nostril. Normally, about 20 inches of the tube should be inserted into the body, but when she did it, she inserted most of the 50-inch tube. I told her she wasn't doing it right. Upon hearing this, perhaps out of panic or anxiousness, she quickly pulled the whole tube out of my body. She was quite rough, and when it was completely out, the bottom of the tube was full of blood. After that, I experienced severe pain in my esophagus whenever I turned or swallowed. This lasted for a couple of months. One of the biggest challenges during that time was how to deal with the people inflicting pain on me. Whenever I encountered such a situation, I always thought of Jesus when he was crucified. Looking at the people who were crucifying him, he said, "Forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing."
The portion of each force feeding varied greatly. Zhiming would gain a lot of weight in a short period of time and then lose weight rapidly.
Within a couple of weeks, I looked like a skeleton. At that time, I could wrap my waist with my hands.
The hospital's plan was to scare Zhiming out of his hunger strike. When they realized that it wouldn't work, they sent him to the infectious ward.
The ward housed patients with infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, hepatitis, etc. I didn't think much about it. I thought I would be fine. I just need to maintain my state. And indeed, I was never infected.
Zhiming was extremely weak. The hospital required nurses to check if he was alive every 2 hours.
Once I made up my mind to counter the persecution with a hunger strike, all other thoughts and distractions were gone. But my physical suffering was enormous, so I often recited Falun Gong scriptures to resist the pain, like this poem. A great enlightened one fears no hardship. Having forged an adamantine will, free of attachment to living or dying, he walks the path of far rectification, confident and poised. I was in a semi-conscious state when I was later transported from Beijing to the Jinzhou prison in Liaoning province. During the transfer, some police officers scolded me, "Don't be lazy." When they realized that I couldn't move, they dragged me and threw me directly into the car. At that time, my body was very light. I guess I was only 80 to 90 pounds. I had no strength to defend myself. I was thrown directly under the car seat like a sack.
He's the youngest of us 4 brothers, so we tended to protect him when we were growing up. We had similar beliefs and personalities. We played together often when we were young. He was easygoing and outgoing. My brother took great care of the family's finances. When it was time for him to go to college, he enrolled in a military academy because it was free and even provided stipends. He often sent money to my parents. When I was in college, he even sent money to me. When I heard he'd been on a hunger strike for a very long period of time, I was really worried. So sometimes when I was having a good meal, I would be reminded of my brother, who had nothing to eat.
While in prison, I felt that even under the high pressure of the Chinese Communist Party, many people still had kind hearts. This is the reason practitioners try to clarify the truth about Falun Gong and tell them about the CCP's persecution. When I arrived at Jinzhou's Nanshan prison, a doctor was put in charge of my medical treatment. After running some tests, the doctor said I had no reflexes at all. He even used a flashlight to see if my pupils were dilated. For the next 3 years, I used a wheelchair sent to me by my family. This doctor was touched by practitioners' determination to safeguard our faith. Seeing our sacrifices, he felt obligated to help me. He would often spend his own money to give me additional nutrition. He bought vegetables and asked the staff to squeeze the juice to mix with my liquid food. From his actions, I knew he was very kind. I told him the truth about Falun Gong and the persecution. While talking, I felt that he was still hesitant. After all, he worked for the CCP. He once told me, "I don't know much about the teachings of Falun Gong, but I know that some terminally ill people in our community recovered because of practicing it. That I know."
Not all Falun Gong practitioners are lucky enough to meet such a kind doctor. Several practitioners in the same prison as Zhiming were serving sentences of more than 10 years. All were suffering from different degrees of abuse. Although still on hunger strike, Zhiming's health began to improve under the care of the doctor. His state was much better than during his hunger strike in Beijing. However, an unexpected event put him in danger once again.
In August or September 2008, a prisoner was moved into my cell. He was an intelligence official in his 60s. He'd been sentenced to 10 years in prison for leaking intelligence. He was moved into my cell because he'd suddenly become paralyzed and could only move his right arm. The hospital sent a prisoner to take care of him. The caregiver was a violent criminal serving a 15-year sentence. He was bored and always tormented this elderly man for entertainment. When washing his face, the caregiver demanded that he keep his eyes open. Because of the repeated abuses, the elderly man had become too scared to disobey the caregiver's demands. So he opened his eyes, and the caregiver rubbed the towel into them. The elderly man screamed in pain, much to the amusement of the caregiver. A few days later, the elderly man went into a trance-like state. During the night, he often screamed and had nightmares. I felt that if this continues, he would die, not of illness, but from torture. Seeing such a situation, I couldn't stay quiet. I told the prison staff about it many times, but no action was taken. With no other options, I started to refuse infusions. Within 2 days, my physical condition rapidly declined. When I lay down, my heart rate would reach 160 beats per minute. I was afraid that my heart would stop beating if I turned to the side. 2 days later, at around 6 p.m., the doctor suddenly came in. He checked my pulse and then walked out and made a phone call to the prison warden. He asked him to take care of the situation right away. The doctor then came back in and told me my condition was so bad that I wouldn't survive the night. He asked me to accept infusions and promised to fix the situation the next day. He was quite sincere, so I agreed. The next day, they replaced the caregiver. You know, actually, you wouldn't know. The prison hospital was like hell. A patient sitting there, too stiff to move except for his eyes. Only when someone took pity on him, or when he desperately needed it, would he be fed some food. He just sat there, waiting to die. Some prisoners in the hospital had rotting skin all over their bodies. It was so bad that their bones were exposed. This was quite common. The hospital's toilet was the scariest place to be. Many prisoners didn't dare to go there at night. They said they felt like their legs being pulled by ghosts there, and said they were almost pulled to the ground. It was very scary. And seeing the elderly man in that kind of environment, I thought he would soon die from pain.
In this type of prison, replacing a caregiver doesn't help much. Sitting in his wheelchair, not knowing what lay ahead, Zhiming made a decision. He decided to take care of the elderly man himself.
This was not an easy decision to make, because my own physical condition was very bad. Each morning, I helped the elderly man wash up, sometimes sharing my water with him. I washed his face, bathed him, cleaned his hands and feet, and fed him. I also helped him go to the toilet. It was indeed very difficult. Even though I'd done all these things for him, he didn't appreciate it at all. He was always rude and uncooperative. For example, when I fed him, he would sometimes spit the food out or use his functional arm to push my hand away. And he would often rub his feces on his blanket, and I had to clean it up. When I washed his feet, which no one else would do, he would point his fingers at my head like a gun and pretend to shoot me, an action considered taboo in prison. This made me feel terrible. Humans have emotional impulses, but when I feel those, I try to calm myself down. I remembered the teachings of Falun Gong. When you encounter a tribulation, that great compassion will help you overcome it. In that moment, I had to rely on these words to keep me going. I had to treat the elderly man with compassion. So I ignored all these provocations and did what I had to do. In fact, during that period, I didn't know how long I could last. I didn't know what my future would be like. I just did what I was supposed to do according to Falun Gong's principles. One day in June, the elderly man died unexpectedly. His family came to the prison. They were quite touched that despite such poor conditions, their loved one, who'd been paralyzed for 6 months, had no bed sores. Even his old wounds were healed. The doctor said that in all his years of working in prison, he'd never seen a paralyzed patient without bed sores. When I was finally released in 2009, I was extremely weak. If it weren't for looking after the elderly man, I wouldn't have been so frail. I felt I had exhausted my strength. But despite this, I never worried about my health while taking care of him. I was weak and suffered occasional heart pain, stomach aches, and other discomforts, but I never had any fear that I had serious health issues.
In September 2009, Zhiming was sent home, laying in the back of a prison van, accompanied by the doctor and a lot of medical equipment. His body looked just like images you see of Nazi concentration camp victims. His muscles had completely atrophied. He also suffered permanent nerve damage in his right leg from long hours of being bound by chains and physical abuses. The doctor told his elderly parents that his heart and lungs were failing and that he could lose his life at any time. At best, he would be disabled for the rest of his life. Because his gastrointestinal tract was severely damaged, Zhiming was advised to start with a liquid diet.
When I got home, my parents were so happy. My father boiled 2 eggs for me. But when they were brought to me, I had a moment of hesitation. I've been told that eggs were difficult to digest, but my parents made them for me, so it wouldn't be good if I didn't eat them. I told myself, don't worry too much, and ate the eggs. After eating, I didn't have any discomfort. Since then, I've been able to eat normally. I was surprised. My 4-year hunger strike didn't appear to have any effect on my digestive system. After regaining my freedom, I resumed practicing the Falun Gong exercises every day and studying the teachings. I started to recover. Thinking back, I feel that the exercises played a great role in my recovery. My muscle atrophy and nerve damage was eventually healed. During my recovery, a guest came to my home. I tried to stand up, but I immediately fell backwards. My feet were in a straight line with my legs. I couldn't bend my ankles. If I forced myself to stand, my tendons would break. So I had to gradually stretch them back to normal. Pretend this is the bed. I would hold onto the edge of the bed, standing on my toes like this, then push my heels down gradually. I had to learn to walk again like a baby. It was very painful at the beginning because my leg muscles were all gone. Since I couldn't bend my legs, I could only inch backwards. Gradually, I stretched my tendons back to normal. Eventually, I was able to walk again.
What did the doctor mean when he said that Zhiming could die at any time and that the best outcome would be a lifelong disability? He meant that the best scenario was a leg disability. However, his failing heart and lungs could take his life. He had lost the normal feeling of hunger, and if he didn't eat, he would have chest pain. Little by little, his internal organs began recovering. He was getting better and better. At first, he had a lot of pain in his feet. After regaining the ability to walk, he was still in a lot of pain. Gradually, his discomfort shrank, and he only felt pain in his toes. Then one day, he said his toes didn't hurt anymore. As he kept practicing Falun Gong, he was healed. I think it's a miracle.
I was released in September 2009. In December, when I was able to walk normally again, I called the prison doctor. He was very happy to receive my call. He was shocked by my recovery and repeatedly thanked me.
After Zhiming was able to walk again, secret police came to see him and found out he had recovered. He felt that he was in danger again, so he bought a ticket to Beijing. In Beijing, he bought a ticket to Yunnan, and from there, escaped China.
In March 2010, Zhiming managed to arrive in Thailand. There, he applied for asylum at the United Nations Refugee Agency.
After meeting in Thailand, we visited a famous tourist attraction to clarify the truth about the persecution. Many Chinese tourists would go there. Zhiming would go there every day with a handmade poster board. There were many practitioners there. Usually, we took shifts for a few hours each, since it was really hot. One day, for some reason, no one came to relieve Zhiming after his shift. There were so many Chinese tourists, and Zhiming didn't want them to miss the chance to learn the truth, so he stayed. He held up the poster board for about 8 hours. He had just fled to Thailand, and his health was still fragile. Sometimes he still experienced pains in his heart, feet, and stomach. If it were me, I wouldn't have been able to hold on for 8 hours. Yet he stayed.
The past 20 years have been a process of starting over and over again. Coming to the United States is also a new beginning for me. My life has gradually stabilized. After all, in this free society, I can continue to perform to the best of my ability and not have to start from scratch abruptly like I had to before. I once wrote a letter to my parents that reads, "I hope that I have faith and spirituality and will never be caught up in worldly pursuits. I hope that the light of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance will forever be in my heart and illuminate my path forward."